Chapter 13 is another double-edged sword subject, and whereas the other characteristics and traits we've been discussing so far in this course were mostly positive and could be used for negative, power in politics is much more of a very careful area that needs to be weighted upon because power in office politics could just as often turn into a negative as it can turn into a positive. And we're going to discuss some of the characteristics of power and some of the negative influences that could apply, that could be used, that power could be used for. Power simply means the capacity that A has to influence B's power. And that is the idea also. It's kind of the synonymous with dependence. If I'm dependent on you for whatever purpose, then I have power over you. If you depend on me for your job, then I have power to tell you what to do. Otherwise, you'll lose your job. If in order for you to be effective, you need my help, well, then also I have some power over you in that respect as well. Leadership is obviously a similar concept of power because leaders very often have power, but they're not precisely the same thing. When it comes to goal compatibility, in other words, when it comes to who has the same goals, well, are you working towards the same goals? Well, leadership requires that you both work to the same goals. If you're working towards different goals, you're not really going to have leadership and the ability to inspire somebody else, whereas power only needs dependence. Even if we have totally different goals, if I have the power over you, then I can force you to do something, regardless of whether it's synonymous with your goals. Direction of the influence. Power concerns with influence of trying to get as much power as possible from everybody around you, whereas again, leadership is really just focusing on the people that work for you. And research emphasis is, in other words, where are the sources of skills that you're going to need to get these things? And leadership is really more about enacting style, trying to do things that draw people to you, increasing your perceived charisma. Whereas power can be used on pretty much everyone, and there are many different types of behaviors and sources, both positive and negative, that can be used to consolidate power. So then that begs the question, okay, where does power come from? Now, power can be formal or power can be informal. Formal power is when I officially have some control over your job or I officially have some control over your behavior or whatever it is. And that comes from coercive power, which is the power to punish you by firing you, for example, if you don't do what I say, or decreasing your pay or not giving you a promotion. And then there's the reward power, which is kind of the carrot that is to the stick of the coercive power. The reward power is, they say, if you do what I do, I can give you bonuses. They kind of go hand in hand. People who are leaders, people who are supervisors, people who are organizational directors very often have both powers inherently, but each element of it certainly is a component of power. And then there's the idea of legitimate power, which is formal authority within the organization. If I am your supervisor in the organization, well, based on the organizational chart and based on the job description and based on the assumptions of what goes on within the organization, I have official power to tell you what to do. And then that's formal power. There's structure, and I have the ability to have power over you based on X, Y, Z. And then there's power that comes from something that's a little bit less formal, and that is personal power. Personal power stems from an individual's unique characteristics and may be independent of the organizational flowcharts. There's expert power. I have power because I am known to the people as being an expert in this particular field, and so therefore people listen to me because they assume I know what I'm doing if I say something. Then there's referent power, which depends on a particular point of reference. That's why it's called reference, and that's identification with the person who wields that power because I have a personality. You refer to me, you defer to me, you refer to me because you think that you trust me. And that's really kind of where charisma comes in, where people's ability to inspire other people and to draw obedience in other people, that's also a source of power. And here are some conclusions about the effectiveness of various sources of power that we've discussed. expert and referent power, in other words, the idea of people relying on you because you have a reputation for knowing what you're doing in this particular area, and referent power, referent power, which is based on charisma, based on people wanting to listen to you because they think you know what you're talking about. They're positively related to performance and commitment. If people trust you because you're an expert, or people trust you because you have charisma and you're able to use your leadership in that respect to inspire people, that can have a positive impact. Reward and legitimate power. Again, these are summary statements which aren't always 100% perfect. These are just kind of based on studies. Reward and legitimate power, which is really the power based on the organizational structure. I have the power to give you a raise if you listen to me, are unrelated to organizational outcomes, which means they're not as effective. You're much better off being, in terms of a leader, in terms of wielding that power, if people respect you, or if people listen to you because they respect you, or because you have charisma, because people look at you as a natural leader, than if you simply have that power based on the organizational chart, or based on the power to reward. And coercive power, in other words, the power to punish you unless you do X, Y, Z, that actually is negatively related to employee satisfaction and commitment, then you can probably figure out why. If people think they're only doing their job because otherwise they're going to get fired, they may take kind of a minimalist attitude towards it, where they only do really what's necessary to not get them fired and not necessarily go above and beyond the call. Then we've got this idea of power tactics. How do people consolidate power? Now, this is not really designed to be a how-to manual, because ideally in a perfect world you wouldn't need to consolidate power. You'd have the leadership, you'd have the expertise, you'd have the charisma, and you wouldn't need to do it. But it's still important to understand, regardless of whether it's a good idea, how people actually do consolidate power amongst themselves. And here are some examples that people use to influence people. There's legitimacy, based on the idea that people will argue that you should listen to me because I'm the legitimate leader, I'm the supervisor, I own the company, I've been put in charge, I'm a higher level manager. There's rational persuasion, which is a good thing, trying to convince people that you're right. There's inspirational appeals. Win one for the Gipper. You can do it. This is an important job that you're doing. Consultation, discussing things with people, hearing their input. The more people feel that their input is being taken into account, the more friendly they're likely to be to a particular person's ideas. Exchange, similar concept. Personal appeals, where you're can you please help me out with this because the company needs you, because I need you, etc. Ingratiation, doing people favors or saying nice things about people in order to get them to like you and want to work for you. There's pressure, of course, which is partly a negative issue. Do this or else XYZ consequences will apply. Then there's coalitions based on the idea, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. Let's work together to try to consolidate the power of multiple people in order to influence the other people in the organization. Okay, so which bases are most effective? Well, rational persuasion, inspirational appeals, and consultation are found to be the most effective ways of consolidating power. And you may notice a theme, by the way, throughout this chapter and throughout many other chapters, that the most effective things you can do are positive tactics, and the least effective things you can do are negative tactics, whereas in the middle you have structural tactics, which just you have power because you were given power. It's kind of in the middle. But rational persuasion is you're convincing the person that you're right, even a subordinate. Inspirational appeals, trying to get people to feel that they have a responsibility themselves. Consulting people and getting their input. Pressure, of course, the least effective because of the idea that it only works in a negative way. Not that it can never work, obviously, but it's kind of, not the ideal situation. The ideal situation is you use positive tactics. But combining all these 9 tactics that we looked at, can certainly be more effective than only using 1 or 2 of them. Now, let's take a look also at kind of the tactics, how they apply to the various directions you might want to exert power. You could exert power on the people below you. You could even exert power on the people above you in the organization, and you can exert power on your equivalent coworkers. If you want to convince your boss or the owner of the company of something, the only way you can really do that is by rational persuasion, convincing the person. You're not going to be able to put a lot. I guess theoretically you could threaten to quit if you want to influence your boss, but you know, pick your tactics. Pick your timing of that. If you do that all the time, obviously, eventually you're going to have your bluff called, and then you're going to lose your job. So you want to do that very, very sparingly. But certainly the best tactic, if you want to convince your boss of something, is to convince your boss of something rather than trying to apply some sort of pressure. Downward influence, you have a lot of different options in terms of if you want to influence your subordinates. Consultation, as we discussed, but also exchange, legitimacy, pressure, all of these things can work on the people below you. And many of these things can work also on your coworkers. If you can persuade or consult, make your coworkers like you, exchange things, personal appeals, these are all things that can work in both directions. It's really the upward influence that you really need to be careful in terms of the power tactics you want to try to use. And this, as all the other things that we've looked at throughout this course, also depends on the culture. There are individualistic cultures. More or less the United States has kind of a reputation of being an individualistic culture, and certainly many Western-style countries, free market, laissez-faire, capitalist countries, see power in terms of personalized terms and a legitimate way of accomplishing a means to an end. If you think that in order to get the company to perform better, you need to exert power, there really isn't anything seen as wrong with that unless you do something illegitimately. Whereas the same thing is true with collectivist cultures. It's almost like the inherent types of power, the types of power that come from being higher in an organizational structure, are seen as not only legitimate but almost as a necessary component of the culture and as a necessary component of the organization. Now we're going to get into the part of the chapter that involves how politics is affected by and affects the person, him or herself. Political skill is the ability to aggregate political benefits to yourself, the ability to influence others. It's a little like charisma, but charisma is a little more positive, and political skill is a little bit more either negative or morally neutral, whereas charisma, people are following you because they think that you are smart or knowledgeable or skilled. Political skills, they're following you for basically whatever mechanism you can consolidate, basically because you have power over them or because they have to listen to you for whatever reason. Politically skilled people are more effective users of all these influence tactics, all these 9 tactics that we looked at before. That kind of goes under one category. Now, you might be only skilled in a couple of them, and that might be enough, or you might be skilled in all 9 of them, but not quite as skilled. It's kind of the ability to aggregate some of these factors to give yourself a power base. And those with political skill, of course, can exert their influence over others. So these are people that essentially have power, and the reason why they have power is because they're able to aggregate some of these skills to force people to listen to them. Now, this is again a little more negative and a little bit more of a controversial slide over here in terms of, and these are all the thoughts of the authors and developers of the textbook of the course. But people with this kind of power at least have the tendency to put their interests ahead of others because they've got the power to do pretty much what they want. Objectify others, not necessarily look at them as people, but look at them as mechanisms by which their will and their goals can be accomplished. Reacts to threats against their competence, because people with power tend to look at themselves as being the be-all, end-all, and tend to be overconfident. But of course, then we got the slide that reacts, well, it could also be positive. People could use their political influence and their political power to do things for the benefit of other people or the benefit of society. This is a course about organizational behavior, but everything we've discussed can be also applied to the context of politicians and government. And certainly people that are powerful and in governments have the tendency to have these negative traits, but can also have these positive traits. Lord Acton once said that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely, based on the idea that people who do have power tend to let that power go to their head and think that they're entitled to, behave pretty much how they want, and they're entitled to certain things that maybe ordinary people would not get. And that leads us to kind of this fusion of politics in organizations. You've got politics relative to government, and you've got politics within an organization. Sometimes when people, you have sniping within a group, within a business, they call that organizational politics, and that's really what organizational politics are. They're activities that not required part of your formal role as a person in the organization, but they try to influence, distribute advantages and disadvantages through the organization. Organizational politics or business politics has a very negative connotation, and for good reason. These are things where people try to gain influence by establishing relationships with the superiors and establishing power over subordinates. Convincing people that they're very talented, and that may not necessarily be focused in the direction that the organization needs to go. It may be focused in the direction of increasing the well-being of that individual. Now we're going to turn in the rest of the chapter to a discussion of essentially how to limit organizational behavior politics. With almost the precept that although we discussed how politics can be a positive thing, organizational politics within a company usually tends to be a negative thing. So we're going to discuss kind of what factors tend to lead to a proliferation of these politics, and what can be done to kind of avoid these situations. First of all, you have to watch for traits that encourage political action. Traits, I mean, in terms of an organizational structure of a business and of an individual. High self-monitors. Internal locus of control. Is there a group that is in charge of monitoring other people's behavior, and is that locus means like a place of control? There's an internal place in the company, or I don't mean place, a group of people that have control over the rest of the company, and a high need for power of an individual. These are again some of the things that lead to people engaging in office politics. Situational influences like lower organizational investments, in greater number of perceived alternatives, greater expectation of success. These are things that where people, because of the fact that they think that there's a wide variety of ways in which they can attain success. If everybody believed that the only way they could attain success would be to produce for the company and to have the company do well, then there wouldn't be as much of a need for politics. People would rely on positive influences. But if people have other ways, first of all, they haven't really contributed that much to the success of the organization. They think that there are other ways to get ahead in the food chain rather than performance. They expect to get ahead in the food chain without performance. That leads them to engage in politics to try to kind of surreptitiously get ahead. And then there are some factors within the organization itself that lead to this sort of jockeying for position. Organizational resources are declining or distribution shifting. In other words, there's maybe a budget or a budget in terms of who's going to get raises or who's going to get resources within an organization, and that's limited or that's declining, and people kind of have to think they have to fight for their share. Low trust among the people, role ambiguity. People are not sure what their role is, so they want to try to use political behavior in order to increase that or heighten their role. Zero-sum reward allocation. This is an interesting one. Zero-sum game means essentially where somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. Well, the same thing is true when you're talking about, if there's a budget in the organization and it's got, $30,000 to spend on raises this year, and that's pretty much it. Well, if there are 10 people vying, they know that if that person gets $5,000 of a raise, that's $5,000 less than I can get. And it could be in terms of raises, it could be in terms of benefits, or it could be in terms of spending within the department itself. Maybe if sales doesn't get a higher budget, won't get a higher budget because marketing got that budget instead. So people engage in politics in order to try to convince the decision makers and the higher ups that they ought to get more. That really, of course, is an element of politics. Democratic decision making. If there's more than one person that is in charge of decision making in the company, that causes people to kind of form alliances and jockey for position. High performance pressures, leading by poor example. That's an interesting one too, where if the supervisors who are supposed to be in charge aren't contributing to the company the way they should, well then that kind of makes the people who are a little further down feel that they don't they don't have to contribute. They could just get ahead in terms of politics. Maybe if somebody performs poorly and is a supervisor, the subordinates will think that that person must have gotten ahead by political means, and I should as well. And of course, unclear performance evaluation systems. If it's not clear how somebody will be evaluated, if it's too much up to the discretion of an individual, so trying to influence that individual to give an untrue report becomes at more of a premium. So let's now continue with kind of the negative effects of organizational politics. Things like increased turnover, reduced performance, increased anxiety and stress, decreased job satisfaction. Really, for a couple of reasons. First of all, the people that lose the political game will get upset and they'll want to leave and they'll want to, complain essentially, and maybe find an organization where they don't have to do so much politicking. And the other thing is that people have to devote their resources to politicking rather than just devoting their resources to performance and devoting their resources for helping the organization. They have to devote their resources to trying to use surreptitious methods to curry favor with the supervisor and the other people. So there are a lot of negatives when it comes to organizational politics. Now, qualifiers is also based on the idea that politics affects other aspects of the job as well. The politics performance relationship is moderated by the individual's understanding of who makes the decisions and why they were selected. If you can convince the people in your organization that the decision-making process is sound and that the people who make the decisions deserve to be making the decisions, well, then people will do less politicking because they'll realize that there's a rationale to it and that if they do a good job for the company and the company does well, they will succeed. If people think that it's just random in terms of who gets hired and who gets promoted and who gets raises, well, then they'll feel the need to kind of do things that have nothing to do with job performance, but have to do with positioning themselves in the best position to curry favor with the people who can give them raises. But if it's a rational decision-making process, then it should have to do with performance. And if it has to do with performance, you don't have to do with much politicking. And then there are ethical issues with regard to political behavior. When politics are perceived as a threat, people respond with defensive behaviors, which, maybe politicking would be criticizing somebody else who may be in line for the same raise or promotion as you are, and that causes the other person to respond, and before you know it, you've got, an all-out war. That leads us to the concept of impression management, which is exactly as it sounds. It's an attempt to manage the impression that others have of them. People may misrepresent themselves if they think that they have to convince their supervisor, rather than just through performance, but through talking and through politics, they have to convince their supervisor that they're valuable. They have to manage their impression, and if they do so in a dishonest way, that causes distrust among everybody. Misrepresentations, assuming they're caught, can discredit the individuals, and they could be seen as insincere, they could be seen as manipulative, they could be seen as very dangerous to the office environment. So the idea in terms of impression management, like everything else, it doesn't inherently have to be a negative. And just managing your own impression could be good when it comes to ingratiation, which means getting people to like you. Getting people to like you can always be a positive way to establish the impression other people have of you. Self-promotion, saying I'm great because of X, Y, Z, can be a little bit more of. It can be used for impression management, but it's more risky and has more negative connotations. The ethics of behaving politically, well, that's kind of a difficult question. Certainly you can't say that it's never ethical to try to gain more influence in the office. If what you're really trying to do is make the company more positively productive, or if you're trying to just really get your fair share, then maybe politics doesn't have any negative ethical connotations. But these are some of the things that people who are looking at political situations have to ask themselves. Why do you engage in politicking? How does it balance any harm? Does it hurt other people whom you're trying to get ahead of? And does it create an environment that is fair and just? Obviously, these are all things that individuals have to ask themselves, but these are sort of the ethical conundrums that come up when you're talking about politics. I mean, this is an example of kind of a little political chart where you have your relationships, and in terms of figuring out your relationships with the other people in the company, it's not just an issue in terms of politicking in a negative way, but figuring out your true role in the company and how you can best act in that role is something that can be useful. Sometimes people should sit down and really figure out who do they work for, who do they work with, what's their relationship to the other departments, etc. And of course, there are some implications, as we finish off any chapter with, for managers in general. You can increasing others' dependence on you, which we discussed at the beginning of the chapter, can help in terms of people's willingness to follow what you have to say. You won't be alone in attempting to build your power bases because people do behave politically, in many, many contexts. Try to avoid putting others in a position where they feel they have no power because then they really don't have any, they almost feel like they have to engage in political behavior to try to curry influence and curry power. That's what we discussed before in the idea of collaborating. Collaborating with people who may not have any official power gives them the impression that they have power, and certainly increases job satisfaction. By assessing behavior in a political framework, you can predict the action of others. You can see, well, will this person try to curry favor with somebody who's a little higher on the totem pole? So these are all things that are, that have to be looked at when you're talking about the very dangerous and very interesting area of workplace organizational power.